I don't have one ordered yet. I really was waiting until I got back. I need to, tomorrow I'm gonna look at where we're at on finances and see what.
Where'd y'all end up going? Camp, where's camp at?
The camp was in north of Dallas in Denton, Texas. Really good experience. Really good for them. It was Friday to Monday for the holiday week. They do it every year on the holiday weekend, so that kids are out on Monday of school. So
I guess, Baptist did okay without a projector, have you heard?
I haven't heard. Yeah, I don't know.
What have you heard about their attendance? We come through last Sunday and it was 4 vehicles.
That sounds about right. I think they'd lost a couple.
But they were two to each vehicle, which I know they probably weren't, because 8 people probably.
Yeah, they're down to 8 maximum. All right. You hit record or start? Okay. All right, good evening. We're going to talk about the Bible and archaeology. We'll start with praying. So, Father, we'll come before you this evening. We thank you for the people who've come here to learn more about your word. We thank you for the ability to learn, the ability to research, to find the things that we're talking about so that it would enhance our walk with you and place a greater trust in you as we grow together. We thank you for this community that we have that wants to learn and seek you more. And may the words that we hear and the knowledge that we have through these studies let us be a brighter light to others around us. We love you, we bless you, and we give you thanks. Amen. All right, so now we're starting, and I'll probably go back from last week's teaching and change the title, because last week I thought it was just going to be a one-week teaching, and then I love archaeology in the Bible, and so I've kind of, y'all seemed to like it last week, so I'm going to keep going with it. It may even go for another couple weeks, but because I think it's really important to understand what we have that talks about the Bible. There's a lot of people out there that want to say the Bible is not accurate, the Bible is not real, Israel didn't exist, all of these things. And so we have some solid evidence that tells us. Last week I mentioned probably my favorite inscriptions that have been found from Israel's enemies. I think I even told you I have those monuments on my wall in my office at the house. But then I realized this week, as I was thinking last week, I said, y'all enjoyed it. I asked that at the end, and y'all said you did. And so I thought, man, I really love archaeology in the Bible. So I got to just remind myself there's so much out there. And there are people in this world that will tell you there's nothing. And so there's so much out there, and I think it's just really important. So I know we want to get to what I had said I was going to teach next, but since we started last week, I just see this through for a couple weeks, if that's okay with y'all. And we'll go from there. So we don't have slides, but I'll go back and forth and show you. I got the tablet. I'll show you what I'm talking about so you can see it. But also you can write it down and go back and listen to the teaching later on and go back and look up these things and look up even more pictures. If you're online, we do have the, thanks to Chris back there, Chris Caldwell's manning the internet station for me. We will have the slides viewable to the people that are watching, or if you go back and listen later. So the first one we're going to talk about, and I really was thinking about where I wanted to start this week on which archaeological finds. I mentioned my favorite ones last week, but then I just got back from Israel, as you all know, and one of my favorite points of the entire trip, people ask me and have asked me, you've been more than once, what do you still find enjoyment in? And I think my favorite enjoyment is watching other people. I think Tommy would say the same thing, watching other people's light bulbs go off and their excitement for different things. And I took Mariah with me last time. I took Maya with me this time. So I think probably my favorite interaction, at least top three. I don't know if I could say the number one, but really high up on the list, top three would be Hezekiah's tunnel with Maya. She was so excited more than anything to be able to go through Hezekiah's tunnel. I kind of built it up for, it's kind of an Indiana Jones moment where you get to go through this tunnel and there's water, and so she absolutely loved it. There was nothing that was going to stop her from going through that tunnel. So we'll start with that one tonight. I'll show you in just a second where we're at. The first one I guess the first inscription that we'll talk about comes from Hezekiah's tunnel. It's called the Siloam inscription or Hezekiah's inscription, and I'll show you here. This is what it looks like. It's literally just a piece of stone with an inscription on it that was inside of a tunnel that was discovered. We come to know this tunnel as Hezekiah's Tunnel. And so this inscription says, and I'll tell you what it says here. It says the tunnel, and it's kind of broken, right? Like a lot of archaeological finds, you'll find it broken. We'll talk about why it's broken here in a minute, but what we have says, the tunnel, and this is the story of the tunnel, while the axes were against each other and while 3 cubits were left to cut, the voice of a man called to his counterpart, for there was Zada in the rock on the right, and on the day of the tunnel being finished, the stonecutters struck each man towards his counterpart, axe against axe, and flowed water from the source of the pool for 1,200 cubits and 100. We don't know what that means. Are questionable if it's 100. And 100 cubits was the height over the head of the stone cutters. Now, all that's on that stone. So that's what it says. It's kind of like sometimes when we think about language, sometimes we'll say stuff in Hebrew and you hear somebody maybe in Russian or something. You'll say, how was your day? How was your day? And it sounds like they say 17 words for our 4. The opposite a lot of times is the case for Hebrew because, Hebrew doesn't have pronouns separated like us, doesn't have different types of verbs separated like us. So a lot of times for Hebrew, it'll be 4 or 5 Hebrew words, but in English it's 17. So it's kind of reverse for us. So it's really condensed there. This was what the inscription is detailing, if you couldn't pick up on it. When the tunnel was being constructed, it's being constructed for a water source, and they started on 2 ends. And so the inscription here is saying, on the day that we met, we could hear each other through the rock, and as we met, the axes struck each other, and then we kept working, and the water flowed. And so it's kind of like a monumental stone or a monumental inscription, or it's just declaring the event that took place at that moment and at that time. And so the point of this tunnel was to bring water from the Gihon Spring. Everybody heard of the Gihon Spring? To the Pool of Siloam. Everybody heard of the Pool of Siloam? And we may talk about the Pool of Siloam later on in another class, but it's a shorthand discussion on it. We were there, and if you've been there before, the Pool of Siloam, when you go to it, it's only about as wide as these chairs and about as thick as the 2 rows. That's all that they had that was available to see. And I remember I'd been there before, and there's kind of like a mud wall right at the, say if the start was right here with these chairs, like a mud wall at that second chair. And there were trees, thick trees behind it. You couldn't see anything behind it, even though you're in the middle of a city. And so this year it was really funny. We were driving along, and I got a text message from a friend of mine at work, and it said, it was an article. It said, hey, check this out. And I don't know if he even knew I was in Israel at the time or not, but it was an article that came out while we were in Israel that said, the Pool of Siloam to be open to visitors for the first time in 2,000 years. And I thought, this is weird. Like, it's on my itinerary. We're headed there. And so I'm sitting up front, and the Israeli tour guide is sitting next to me. I said, hey, man, check this out. He says, oh, that's so funny. I got the same text message from a friend in Japan today. And he said, I don't know what that's talking about. I was there last week, like he's been doing it for 32 years. He's been going there for at least 10 or 15 years. And so what it ended up being, and as we were discussing, we said, more than likely, the land that's behind where this wall would have been, this clay wall that's still there, and all those trees was a disputed part of ownership, where someone owned it, Israel's trying to buy it, they wouldn't sell it. And so what the story is really, and it doesn't come out and say it in the story very clearly, this one was on Fox News, he had like Al Jazeera, neither story said it real clearly, but we put the pieces together. What actually happened was they were able to purchase that land. So what was really cool was by the time we got there on our trip, they had just started the excavation process, but they were making quick work of it. You could see beyond the clay wall. There were workers that day when we were there cleaning it all up. There's not much to do. It's not like they're trying to uncover a city, so there's no like having to be careful. We know it's a pool. We know it's there. So they're literally just finding the walls of the pool. So anyway, interesting deal there. But this is what the purpose of the tunnel was to bring one water from the Gihon spring on one side of the city of David to the other side of the city of David, and specifically to the pool of Siloam that was created at the time. So it dates back to the 8th century, this tunnel does, and so we know that that is the time of King Hezekiah as well. So there's a couple verses that speak to this. I'll read the verses because there's not a lot of times when we're talking about archaeology, we may be talking about just a person that it commemorates, or a time or a place, but here it actually commemorates something that's specifically stated. So I'll read those. The first one, 2 Kings 20:20. It says, "In the rest of the events of Hezekiah and all his mighty deeds, and how he made the conduit and the pool, and he brought water into the city, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah." So that's 2 Kings 20:20. The other one, 2 Chronicles 32, verse 3 through 4, says, "And he took counsel with his officers and his mighty men to stop up the waters of the fountains that were outside the city, and they assisted him. And a large multitude gathered and stopped up all the fountains, and the stream that flowed in the midst of the land, saying, Why should a king of Assyria come and find much water?" So the point there is what he's saying. He was redirecting the water. When you go and you see several places, one of my favorite places, Megiddo, we see it early in the trip, they were under siege, and they thought, the enemies thought, that we can just camp out here because they won't get any food or water. Well, they had underground tunnels to go get water. Same concept here. He was preparing for a time that someone would come and overtake them. So when we talk about the tunnel itself, it's 1,750 feet long. I didn't time myself. I should have timed myself. I think, on average, for an average person, it takes like 25 minutes to go through the whole tunnel. It's not very long, but it's just the fact that it's, and if you're barefooted, it's slower, because there's portions where it's really easy to walk barefoot, and then there's portions where it's pretty painful to walk barefoot. So I think we did that about 20, 25 minutes. It wasn't too long. It starts off whenever you start there at the head of the place there in the city of David. It gets kind of deep. I say deep. It's above my knees. I'm short. And then it was really funny because we got done, and if it was above my knees, it would come up to Maya's hips. And they have a little chart at the beginning of the city of David that shows you where the water level is, and she stood by it. And I said, "You sure you want to go?" She said, "Oh, I don't care. I don't mind getting wet. I'm going." So when we got to the other side, it was real funny. I looked over at her. I said, "You're the shortest person, and you're bone dry." She had rolled her pants up above her knees, but at the first part, and I got a cool little video, or I didn't take it. Matthew behind me took it. I told her, I said, "Hop on my back." So on the deep part, she's on my back, and when we got to the deep part, I put her down, and the rest of the water was below her knee. So it was really funny, but. One thing to note that people have looked at and said if they would have made a straight line, it would have been 40% shorter. They could have, but they didn't have, surveyors, or I'm not sure why. This, along with the Greek tunnel are dedicated to or ascribed to Euphalius, are the two greatest water constructions before the classical period. So in the Iron Age and that region. It's the two greatest waterworks of that time. So it was just.
Was it apparent? Could you tell where they met?
No, we tried to look, and the only thing I could tell as far as where they met, we joked and said, because in the first part you go along, and I'm short, but I end up having to hunch over kind of like this and walk. And I got a picture I'll show you of Maya here in a second. It's pretty short, and then you get to a certain point, and it's actually pretty tall. And we joked and said they got lazy from this side. They were lazy workers, and on that side they were, but that side's shorter. They spent so much time making it tall, and they could have gone quicker in. The inscription, I think a lot of people think the inscription is in the middle where they met, but it's not. The inscription was actually at the one end. They just kind of they inscribed and talked about it. So
is it on the wall?
It's.
Just a loose stone?
It's on the wall. We'll talk about the stone in a minute, but they inscribed just in the wall, and it's not far from, I don't think I put it in here in my notes. It's not in my notes, but it's not far from the side of the pool of Siloam. The inscription was not far from it. In the 1,750 feet, it was probably 50 feet into one side of the tunnel. And a lot of people think that it was in the middle where the two places met, but it's just talking about where the two places meet. What's that you show on there?
Showed it in the wall.
Oh, in the wall, yeah. And what's there now, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's talk about its discovery. So it was discovered in 1838 by a guy named Edward Robinson. And we're not going to talk about everything he did, but we'll talk about some more of his discoveries later on as we go through archaeology. Y'all got me. I'm real geeked out about it. I'm really excited about this stuff. So we'll go for at least a couple more weeks. But Robinson also had some other very significant discoveries. But he's at a time in the late 1800s. You have him, Charles Wilson, Charles Warren. They're all doing lots of discoveries in the old city, Jerusalem, and the city of David, and even the Temple Mount. They're very. They did a neat thing with the Temple Mount to help us understand what the Temple Mount is, where the temple stood, and stuff like that. But they were specifically looking at waterways. They were called upon. They're from Britain, and they were called upon, and they came with a special team to look at the underground waterways and how to better efficiently serve the city of Jerusalem in its modern time with water. And so that's why they're in this water tunnel. That's why they're underneath the Temple Mount. They're looking at different points of water and different holding places. When those three all went through it, in 1838 it was discovered, and those three all go through it, no one noticed the inscription. I'm trying not to talk about a bunch of other stuff, but as you go to where you go down the tunnel, they have what's called Warren's Shaft. We'll talk about it later, but that was another discovery that's right close to it, where David and his men came up and attacked the city and came in behind them. It's pretty neat, but no one noticed this inscription when they went through it because it wasn't very noticeable. One, there's not a lot of light. There's still no lights there. 1838, they didn't have the type of lighting capabilities we had. And it was really just kind of in a moist place. It was the inscription had just, it wasn't very visible. It actually was found later, I think I didn't put the date, but in the late 1800s, maybe 1890s, it was found by a 16-year-old pupil of Conrad Schick, another very famous archaeologist for Israel. He found it, and showed it, and it was discovered long after the tunnel itself was discovered. So it was removed from the temple wall in 1880. 1880. I wrote down the wrong century. But it was removed from the wall by some people, and it was broken when it was removed into 7 pieces. So if you look at the inscription and those online, you'll see kind of the broken nature, and same thing here. You'll see it's kind of broken and pieced back together like a lot of things are. But they tried to chisel it off the wall and remove it. And there was some political stuff going on. This was at the time when the Ottomans, the Turks, were in charge of Jerusalem specifically. They were kind of in charge of everything East Israel. So they had like Jerusalem, Gaza, everything on the Mediterranean coast they were in charge of. And they found out there was a guy, I can't remember his name, he was in charge of the what's called where's it at? He was in charge of basically, I can't remember what it was called back then. He was in charge of like archaeology for Turkey. He wasn't in Israel, but he was made aware of the issue that it had been taken off the wall, and so they sent out a search to find it. It took them about a year, and they finally found it. At the time, it was put on display in Jerusalem because Jerusalem was under control of the Ottomans, and they kind of made a big deal about it, saying basically, since we ruled the area, we own this piece. And truly, at that time, I guess they were in charge of the area. They were over rulership of it. It was in Jerusalem, but later on, as the political climate in Israel changes, it was sent to Turkey. So it's currently on display in Turkey in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, Turkey. There's a replica that's there now. As you go through the tunnel, they have placed a replica up there in the place so you can kind of see where it's at. Israel has requested that Turkey give that to Israel since it was found in Israel. There's always these issues of who owns what. Turkey's not necessarily concerned with the fact that it was found in Israel. Their concern and why they won't give it back is because it was found specifically at the place of Hezekiah's tunnel, which at one point before 1948 belonged to, or actually after 1948, before, I can't remember the different, in the 1990s. It was in East Jerusalem, which belonged to Palestine or the Palestinians. And so when they created the West Bank and they carved all this stuff out, Palestinians moved. A lot of people take sides on this debate. And so since the majority of Palestinians today are Muslim, Turkey's a Muslim country, so that's their issue. That's why they won't send it back to Israel. You'll see on this next picture is a picture of Maya. And this is in a part that's kind of not so small that we were hunching down, but you can see how narrow it is. It's a very narrow tunnel. If you go and you're claustrophobic or anything, there are places where it's super narrow and you have to bend down. So, but you can see the smile on her face. She absolutely loved it. So the next one we'll talk about, and here is the picture of it. I remember when this was discovered. I have subscribed to Biblical Archaeological Review, a magazine, a journal, for years. And I still have the journal that came in when this one was discovered and they published it. So this is what's referred to as Hezekiah's Bulla, King Hezekiah Bulla. Anybody ever heard the word Bulla? B-U-L-L-A. So a bulla, or plural is bulle, B-U-L-L-A-E, is kind of like a stamp. So they'd use soft clay, and in other places they would use wax. It's the same thing we think of like when you see a scroll and they put a wax stamp to seal it. That's what a bulla is. But in the ancient world, they didn't really use wax. They used really soft clay that would harden. So on legal documents, things that they wanted to make sure that it was sealed and they understood it came from someone. So this, for instance, would be King Hezekiah's seal as he sent stuff out. Now, it's really small. It's a 1/2 inch by a 1/2 inch. It didn't have to be big, right? Because this isn't some big, great monument. This is him just putting his stamp of authenticity on anything that went out from him. The inscription on the stamp says, "Of Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah." If you look at it, I'll hold it up for y'all here again. If you look at it here, back to Tommy, that says all that. That's what it says. And that's in an older Hebrew. I don't know how familiar y'all are with the older Hebrew, but that is the older, what we'd call Paleo-Hebrew, not in the modern script. So, and that is part of what testifies to its age. So it has a sun figure with 2 wings flanked by an ankh on each side, which is a symbol of life in the ancient world. It dates to the time of Hezekiah, 8th century to 7th century, late 7th century, somewhere around there. It was discovered in 2009, 2010, a dig that was going on by right by the Temple Mount by Dr. Eilat Mazar, M-A-Z-A-R. She is a very famous pro-Israelite archaeologist. She had a lot of discoveries. We'll talk about her multiple times as we move forward and talk about the archaeology of Israel. But she's very famous for the city of David. She discovered the palace of David. When you go to the city of David, that's one of the first things you see as you move down the hill, is his palace was up on the top of the hill. I remember Maya, just kids, they pick up on different things, and she was very attentive to everything that was going on. Half the time she'd have an earphone listening to our guide. But I remember when he said, look at this, this was the palace of David. And she looked at me and said, "Did he just say this was the palace of David?" I said, "Absolutely." She said, "That is so cool." And so she just thought that was so cool because she could connect. Everybody knows the story of David. And so she was very much a part of that. She was the daughter of Benjamin Mazar, another famous archaeologist. So she followed in her dad's footsteps. She just passed away, I think, 2020 or 2021. Just real phenomenal. We owe a lot to her and her dad. Her dad was a president of Hebrew University there in Jerusalem. Both of them did tons of work on the Temple Mount. That's where they're focused, Temple Mount, and then later she's working on the city of David as you move down into the more ancient part of the city there. It was published in 2015, so that kind of gives you a time reference from discovery to publication. It takes about 5 to 10 years to really get peer review on it, other scholars to look at what you found, to truly, think you have a hypothesis of what you think it is, when it's dated, but to verify all those things and then publish them. This was found basically in an ancient trash dump that was next to the Temple Mount, along with 33 other seals and figures. And when I say a trash dump, it was associated with an administration building that was there on the south end of the Temple Mount. So kind of help you orient. You've seen pictures of the Temple Mount maybe. And then when we have this is way before this, but Herod's extension, and when he built the big portico and stuff on the Temple Mount, and on the south end, that's where he built it. But it was built there because that was the main entrance for all the people to come up on the Temple Mount. Today, which is pretty neat, the steps on the southern side are still there. You can walk up those same southern steps, at least a portion of them, not all of them. So this was an administrative building that was on the south end, the entrance to the Temple Mount, and it was destroyed. This building was destroyed by the Babylonians in the 7th century, and so a lot of times they didn't have a trash system, right? Trash would end up in a ditch outside of a building or in a valley down below. So here, this was found in a trash pile, and I'll read this this is a quote I have from Dr. Mazar, Adelaide Mazar. She said, although seal impressions bearing King Hezekiah's name have already been known from the antiquities market since the middle of the 1990s, what she's saying there is, we've known that there's been inscriptions of King Hezekiah, but because they've all been found and not found by scientists, not found by archaeologists, they're just in the market in Jerusalem, nobody could authenticate them. So she's saying, even though some of us knew those were authentic, the scientific world wouldn't accept them because they're so small and they could be easily falsified. So she said, since we've known this since the middle 1990s, some with winged scarabs, a dung beetle symbol, and others with winged sun. This is the first time that a seal impression of an Israelite or Judean king has ever come to light in the scientific archaeological excavation. So it was one where all the measures were in place, where nobody could deny what had been found. And so this was in 2015 she published this. It speaks to the highly developed nature of the Israelite kingdom at the time of Hezekiah. Remember when we talked about Tel Dan Stella, how it spoke of the house of David, and how that spoke to how David wasn't just a peon mayor of a small village. Same type of mentality here. This was an administrative building, and these seals were seals that authenticated things that the king was sending out. And so this wasn't just some king over a city. I mean, if it's a city, he can have the city. If it's a small village, he can have them all gather around and tell them what he wants to tell them. But he's sending out legal documents to the rest of Israel, to other nations, and so it authenticates his purpose or his might and clout as a king and Israel itself. So that portion on the south side is called the Ophel, O-P-H-E-L, and again, it's the southernmost entrance to the Temple Mount. When you go there today, you'll actually see some of these buildings. You see the stairs that go up to the Temple Mount, but then archaeological digs, you just keep going down and down and down to older periods. And so this was in one of those small, down the bottom they have a lot of mikvaot, baptisms, pools, as people were ascending up they had to cleanse themselves, immerse themselves. And then you have these other administrative buildings. This came from one of those buildings there. So the next one we have is called, here's what it looks like, Sennacherib's Prism. Now, calling it Sennacherib's Prism, I should say Sennacherib's Prisms, plural. So this really belonged in last week's discussion about monuments against Israel, because that's what this is. So Sennacherib was a ruler of Assyria, and so this would be, if he's making these inscriptions, what do you think this would entail? This ruler of Assyria that invaded Israel. So what do you think's on this?
There's a lot of words on it.
There's a lot of words. At a very minimum, it's going to detail his overcoming and defeating other kings. That's what most of these inscriptions are going to do. So they're also referred to as Sennacherib's annals, like Annals, annals. There's actually 3 prisms total. We'll talk about where they come from, but there's 6 sides to them, and each side is kind of a paragraph, and it's all in Akkadian, which was the language of the Assyrians, not Louisiana Akkadian, but Akkadian of Akkad, which is Assyrian Assyria. The first one we'll talk about is the Taylor Prism. It was discovered by Colonel Robert Taylor. It was discovered in Nineveh in 1830. So a lot of this stuff in the 1900s, we have a lot of these British archaeologists coming down. We've talked about Sir Austin Henry Layard. We talked about him before. We've talked about later on in the 20th century, we just talked about Charles Warren and Conrad Schick and Edward Robinson. So 1900s, you had a lot of British people coming down and looking and digging. So it's found in the ancient city of Nineveh in 1830, and it stayed in Iraq. There's an interesting history. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it stayed in Iraq till about 1845, and then it mysteriously comes up missing, and so there was like no proof of it for a while, except for kind of like, what was it, the Mesha stone, where somebody had taken like paper mache imprints. So they did the same thing here. There were a couple of different styles of imprints that were made over the few years after it was found. So they knew it existed, but it just kind of disappeared. And so they were like, well, at least we have these copies of it. We can know that it existed. We can, study it, see what it said. Later on, they eventually find it. Colonel Robert Taylor, after he died, his wife confessed that she had it. And it was purchased by the British Museum from his wife. Later, there's another prism in 1919. There was a prism that was discovered and purchased from a dealer in Baghdad, and it was authenticated as well. That one's referred to as the Oriental Prism. So the first one's called the Taylor Prism, named after Colonel Robert Taylor. This one's called the Oriental Prism, named after the Oriental Museum of Chicago, who bought it and now houses it. So if you ever make your way to Chicago, that's something that's really close, that you can go to Chicago and see one of these prisms. Most of the artifacts, from Israel's archaeology, you have to see either in Israel Archaeological Museum or the British Museum in London, England, or in Iraq in their museum. So that's one that's here in the United States. Later, in 1970, another prism was purchased I didn't write it down. There's a famous, someone had found it and purchased it in Iraq, and they brought it to one of those auctions, the famous auctions in New York or something. It starts with an S. I can't remember. Anyway, and it was bought there by Israel, and now it's housed in the Israel Museum. So you can see that when you go to Jerusalem. It was bought in 1970. So 1830, the first one was discovered, 1919, the second one, and 1970. So that's why it's kind of referred to as his annals, plural, or Sennacherib's prisms, plural. But usually when it says Sennacherib's prism, singular, it's referring to the Jerusalem prism that's housed there in Israel. And it details his campaign in Israel. And it roughly follows like 2 Kings 18 through 19. But we talked last week about how, depending on who's writing history, kind of depends on how the history is told, right? So if you look in 2 Kings 18 and 19, you'll see where Hezekiah basically says that Sennacherib and his armies came against Israel, and they were going to take Jerusalem. But the angels of the Lord came out against Sennacherib and killed a bunch of their men, and they fled, and they didn't take Jerusalem. The Hezekiah in Sennacherib's events and the one that's in Israel famously says that he was there and going to sack Jerusalem, but he left Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. And what he means by that is basically, I could have killed everybody, sacked Jerusalem, but I left him like a bird in a cage. He's under my control now. He's more beneficial to me alive in Jerusalem. He can't leave. He was basically on house arrest, and he had to pay a bunch of stuff to Sennacherib in Assyria for his freedom, for his life, and for the life of for the life of everybody in Jerusalem. There's an inscription here. I'll kind of read part of the inscription where it says, "As for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, who had not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities." Now, there's discrepancies between the three. I used to think that these three prisms were identical. There's some discrepancies, but they're very minor, but they all kind of relay the same story. Like this one says 46 of his fortified cities. Another one doesn't say 46, it says something else, but it's all basically the same thing. It says, "I sacked 46 of his fortified cities along with many smaller towns, taken in battle with my battering rams. I took as plunder 200,150 people, both small and great, male and female, along with a great number of animals, including horses, mules, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird, or a bird in a cage, in his royal city of Jerusalem. I then constructed a series of fortresses around him, and I did not allow anyone to come out of the city gates. His towns, which I captured, I gave to Matinti, king of Ashdod, Padi, ruler of Ekron, and Silibel, king of Gaza." And so these are all kind of cities that you would probably recognize: Ekron, Gaza, Ashdod. They're cities that were belonging to the Philistines. And so they have this unified contract with Assyria, so he's coming in. He's got them under control, so he gives all of Israel's wealth and cities to those people. And so that's the Sennacherib's prism. Like I said, there's very minute differences between the two. I think the one in Israel, the Jerusalem prism, is the only one that mentions like a bird in a cage, but they all relay the same thing, that he left Hezekiah in Jerusalem so that he could pay tribute to him. The next one, we've got 15 more minutes. The next one we'll talk about. This is just one example. It's probably the most famous one. It's called the Lachish Ostracah. So in Ostrakhan, I think we talked about a potsherd. Have we talked about a potsherd before? A potsherd is like a small piece of clay. It's kind of like a sticky note. In Ostrakhan is a larger piece of clay that they're writing like letters, or, this isn't something that was like a sticky note. This was something much larger. Now this one's broken, so it's not the full one, but it would be like, almost like they made a sheet. If the potsherd's a sticky note, this one is a full sheet of paper. And so they're writing on clay here, and these are called the Lachish Ostracah, which is plural for Ostrakhan. It's also referred to, and I'm going to use English and not Hebrew from here on. Instead of Lachish, I'll say Lachish. That's kind of how we say it in English. So it's the Lachish Ostracah. That's spelled Lachish. Also referred to as the Lachish letters. That's kind of how I always refer to them. It's also called the Hoshaiah letters, Hoshaiah. They're clay letters. They're written in ancient Hebrew. Again, we're talking about Paleo-Hebrew, since we're all kind of familiar with that. They were discovered by a guy named James Starkey in 1935. This was his third visit on the what they call the Welcome, Wellcome, the Welcome excavations. So he found them on his third trip, or his third excavation there. They were published 3 years later in 1938 by Henry you don't need to know it. His name was changed. There's some history there. But they've been studied a whole lot ever since we found them. There's a total of 9 letters. And actually, I was in Israel, and someone said more, like 14. And I don't know if they found more. I need to look into it more. What I'm familiar with is 9 Lachish letters. They're dated to the 8th century, late 8th century, early 7th century BCE. So a lot of stuff we're finding is around that period of time, right? But this is right before the Babylonian captivity. And what they're really discussing is they're discussing the events and the time leading up to Nebuchadnezzar taking over Israel, taking over Jerusalem right before they're taken into captivity in Babylon. I have a couple of the inscriptions here. The first one, and again, we're thinking about old inscriptions. For an old inscription to bear the name Yahweh in it is very significant. So almost every one of these inscriptions talks about Yahweh, but I'll give you the first one. It says, "To my Lord Yahush, May Yahweh cause my Lord to hear tidings of peace today, this very day. I really just love ancient writings because I think I've said this before. People don't change, only technology. Like that just sounds like something that we would say to each other. Hey, I hope you're doing good today. You call somebody up. Hey, how are you? He says, who is your servant? A dog that my Lord remembered his servant? May Yahweh make known to my Lord a matter of which you do not know. So he's basically giving a word of encouragement. Like, you're no dog. You're a great person that's mighty, and you're a man of Yahweh. And I pray today that Yahweh reveals something to you that you don't know yet. One of the more famous inscriptions here, it says, may Yahweh, and I don't remember which one this is. May Yahweh cause my Lord to hear this very day tidings of good. Again, it's a letter, and so it starts off with a greeting. And now, according to everything which my Lord has sent, this has your servant done. So basically saying, I've done everything you told me to do. I wrote on the sheet according to everything which you sent to me. And inasmuch as my Lord sent to me concerning the matter of Beit Harapid, there is no one there. And as for Semaiah took him and brought him up to the city. And your servant is not sending him there anymore. But when morning comes round, and may my Lord be apprised that we are watching for the fire signals of Lachish according to all the signs which my Lord has given, because we cannot see Azekah. All right, so this is very significant. I bring up this one, it's kind of long. It talks about, again, a blessing from Yahweh to the person he's writing. This letter is actually coming from Jerusalem to Lachish. And so this person is saying, we've done everything you asked us to do. Here's an update on some stuff we've seen. And by the way, we're watching for the signal fires of Lachish because we can't see Azekah. And so you have Jerusalem, and Jerusalem can see Lachish, and Lachish can see Azekah. If you stand at Lachish today, it's hard to see because of different scenarios, but you can imagine, you can see Azekah. I don't know that you can see Jerusalem today for different circumstances of geography and stuff, but in the ancient world, if you stood in Lachish, you could look one direction to see Jerusalem, look another direction to see Azekah. And they had these signal fires, so at night the fires would be up and they could see them from a distance. And there's another writing later on where they said, we can no longer see the fires of Azekah. And what that meant, because of the way of attack, the way Azekah was positioned, the enemies would come from the north. I had a discussion with someone the other day. They said, who was the enemy from the north that's prophesied of in the scriptures? And we think of prophecies today, and everybody says, well, that's Russia. So when Russia starts doing something crazy, we get end-time prophecies because they're from the north and they're going to come down. Actually, the enemy from the north was actually the enemy from the east because of the desert in Jordan that's there today and Iraq. The enemies from Assyria and Babylon had to go up and come down from the north. And so the way Azekah's positioned, it basically got beat up all the time. Any enemy that's coming in Israel, they beat up on Azekah because of where it was at. And so they knew, Lachish would know when they no longer saw the signal fires of Azekah, prepare for an attack from the Babylonians. And Jerusalem, they're saying the same thing. We're watching your signal fires because we can't see Azekah. So when you give us a different signal, they would give them a different signal to let them know Azekah had fallen. And so very significant. If you go to Lachish today, that's a really cool site for me. We went, it was closed. They said, it's really weird. All the sites are open except for two, Lachish and Azekah. As far as closed to the Welcome Center and the stuff that they offer for background, you can still go up on the mound. But you go there, they added a new section for the city wall to show how it's really neat how they defeated the attackers. They added a portion of the wall on so that they could lean a certain way because they had these battering shields, but when they'd lean out to throw the spears, they would be able to hit them in their right shoulder. So really neat. But if you go to the top where the main city wall is, they have a big picture and a description of these Lachish letters because that's where they were concerning. We still got a few minutes. So this one is called the Cyrus Cylinder. So a lot of times when people wanted to write something, we talked about I didn't even mention this earlier, King Hezekiah's bulla, the stamp. We think of like a stamp like we would stamp stuff. Actually, what they had in the ancient world, they would have a string. Sometimes it would be like they would wear it as a necklace. And it would be a clay cylinder, really tiny. It wouldn't be a stamp that they would do like this. They would lay that down and roll it. They would take the string and roll it across the clay. And so it would be kind of like this. You notice how the cylinder has words all the way around it. So whenever he wanted to make this decree, he could make 50 tablets, and he would just roll this down. Obviously not the King Cyrus, but his people, somebody, would just roll this over a tablet, roll it over a tablet. It's kind of like the ancient printing press. So we have this famous Cyrus cylinder. It's ancient clay. It's written in Akkadian. Again, that is the language of Assyria. It was dated to the 6th century BCE, so 500s BCE, 6th century BCE. It was discovered in Iraq and another site kind of farther in South Iraq. And this cylinder praises Cyrus, right? What do you think it's praising him for? Defeating his enemies, like all of them, right? So it praises Cyrus. Cyrus the Great, we kind of know him from the Bible, really well-known king. He was a Persian king. The first part discloses his genealogy. It talks about who all came after him. And the second part talks about him as being basically the King of Kings, that he had defeated everybody. If you remember the Black Obelisk, when it talked about Jehu giving tribute to the king of Assyria, that was kind of the same concept. Remember, the Black Obelisk had 4 sides and 5. It talked about defeating 5 kings or lording over 5 kings. This is kind of the same way. It talks really bad about Nabonidus, which was the king of Babylon, that Cyrus defeats, right? So Cyrus defeats the king of, from our biblical standpoint, he defeats the king of Babylon, takes over Babylon and Assyria, and he allows Israel to go back to Judah after the Babylonian captivity. And so this cylinder says that he was chosen by Marduk, which is a famous god of the Mesopotamian region. He was chosen by Marduk to be a great king and rule over all the kings. And in the second section, it talks about how Cyrus returned all the peoples to their native lands. And he goes on to appeal and says, "May all the gods of those people deal with me mercifully, since I returned them to their land of their gods." That's just kind of how they viewed, that to them in the ancient world, and maybe even to Israel in some sense, the gods were regional. They were, they didn't have this concept outside of Israel of one true God over all things. And so it's kind of disputed like everything else. Some say, well, he doesn't specifically mention Israel. He doesn't specifically mention Judah or the Jews or those of Judea. He just mentions sending all the people back to their lands. But when we put all the pieces together, let's use a little common sense. So talks about Cyrus the Great King, the very king that's depicted in the Bible. It's dated to the very time that we have in our Bible that says that he allowed Israel to go back to Judea. And it's saying those very things. So common sense tells us this is a good depiction. It's currently housed at the British Museum. When you go to, I had this weird thing. Our tour guide didn't want to go to the Bible Lands Museum, which is across the street from the Israel Museum. And I insisted on going. And he said, okay, we'll spend 15 minutes or something. We'll spend a little bit longer. And it was, I forgot that the museum's 3 stories. And so I'm running around the first story trying to point out the few things that I wanted our people to see. And when we got ready to leave, I went and asked the lady at the front desk, I'm like, where is this? And she's like, it's on the 3rd floor down. And so I just went down there. They have a whole exhibit down on the 3rd floor relating to the Babylonian captivity. Now, it doesn't house this. This is in the British Museum. But it houses some other cylinders from that time period and speaks of the rulers of Babylon and the Persian kingdom. So, neat little place that I finally found when it was too late. Last inscription. This is called the Pilate Stone, also known as the Pontius Pilate Stone, but it's called the Pilate Stone. So this was found in 1961. It was discovered at Caesarea Maritima, also known as Caesarea on the Sea. You have 2 Caesareas, Caesarea Maritima, which is on the sea, Caesarea Philippi, which is really known today as Banyas, which is up in the north near Tel Dan. This was discovered. This is actually our first stop when we go to Israel. Depending on when we land, we drive up to and stay at the Ramada right there by Caesarea Maritima. So it's a limestone block discovered in June of 1961 by an Italian archaeologist. You don't really hear a lot about Italian archaeologists in Israel, but Maria Teresa Fortuna Canavet. That's who it was. She was excavating under Dr. Antonio Frova, and they were looking at the area of the ancient theater. There's a big, huge theater that's there. There's a lot that's there, but it was built by Herod the Great. This theater was around between 22 and 10 BCE, so just before the time that Yeshua was born, and it was along the entrance to the city of Caesarea. This artifact that we have today is just a fragment. I'll show it to you again. You kind of see, like a lot of things, it's just broken off. You can't read the whole inscription, but we can piece it together. And so, but what we have is a small fragment, and it was a dedicatory inscription of a kind of a building, probably like a temple of that time period, that was constructed probably in honor of Tiberius, the emperor, and it was dated to, the temple itself was dated to 26 AD, 36 AD, right in the middle of Yeshua's ministry. And so we know that this place, Caesarea Maritima, was built by Herod the Great before Yeshua, but this inscription on this building for what we think was a temple was during the time of Yeshua's ministry. So dated very contemporary to him. The stone was reused in the 4th century as a building block, so basically it was destroyed and they took the stuff. We talked about how they just built on top of stuff, so it was used as a building block later. And so it's a 1st century inscription, and it says, "To the divine Augustus Tiberius, or Tiberium," and then the next line, "Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this." So that's what we have of the inscription. And so it's the only description or inscription of Pontius Pilate that we have outside the Bible and in the ancient world. And so again, critics of the Bible at some point said, this talks about Pontius Pilate being this great ruler over the land that was part of the trial of Jesus, but we don't have any proof it exists. Lo and behold, we have this dedicatory inscription that speaks of not only Pontius Pilate, but Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, the very thing that we know in the scriptures. So that's where we'll stop tonight. Covered some really cool ones when it comes to archaeology in the Bible. Any questions at all? None at all. Yep.
Why did a lot of these things end up in the British?
Because those who find them get to keep them, Finders keepers, losers weepers. So a lot of these things are discovered by those British excavations early on. So you had a huge flood in the 1900s of archaeologists coming from Britain into the whole ancient Near East. They're in Egypt, they're in Israel, they're in Iraq. They're going down and doing all these archaeological digs. There's a famous, my mind's gonna, y'all may help me, I can't remember her name.
Wasn't Britain didn't they kind of control Israel and Jerusalem?
Yeah, they controlled, at that time. That's right. Yeah, so Britain had control over it. We talked about the Ottoman Empire. After the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, Britain had control of it. Neat little story I told some teens this weekend. I couldn't go through the whole weekend and not be a little nerdy a little bit. But the whole weekend was based around 1 Samuel. It was about finding the unsung heroes of 1 Samuel. People that, especially teens, they don't remember them in their Bible. And so it was talking about the last sermon they heard from Brian was on when Jonathan takes his armor bearer up against the Philistine camp at Michmash. And he goes up, and there's a place, a crevice between two rock faces, and he says, it's really a beautiful story. Everybody else chicken, right? Saul doesn't want to go out against the Philistines, nothing. Jonathan says, I'll take my armor bearer, 2 people. And Jonathan says, hey, there's a Philistine camp. What you think? You want to go take it? And the armor bearer's like, sure, maybe the Lord will give us a victory. He was like, and I really loved how Brian kind of preached the sermon, but, they went forward on a maybe. It wasn't like the Lord has told us we'll have a victory. He said, sure, I'll go with you. Maybe Yahweh will give us a victory. And so they go down to the valley. They're looking at the Philistine camp, and they said, Jonathan says, hey, look, here's what we'll do. We'll make sure they see us, and if they say, stand right there, we'll come down and defeat you, then we'll stay here, and we'll know that we're supposed to be defeated. But if they say, come on up here, then we know that Yahweh is going to give us a victory. And so they go out there, and they look down. It's really a funny story. The Philistines look down, and basically they're like, hey, some of these scared Israelites came out of their cave. There's only 2 of them. And they say, come on up here. The Hebrew literally says, come on up here, we'll teach you a lesson. And so then they're like, oh, God's going to give us a victory. So they go up to the camp in this passage, this passage that's a narrow passage up to it. And it says on the first day they defeated 20 Philistines in the camp. And then the next day, there's a confusion that goes on. And all the Philistines start killing each other. And Saul's like, who's battling against these people? Count all of our troops. See who went over there. And it's 2. Anyway, so fast forward to 1918, and you have British is in control of a lot of stuff over there, and they still don't have everything. So they're fighting the Turks in World War I. And so when they went into Israel, they bought a bunch of Bibles, and they gave them to the British troops. And I'm sorry, I just went on a tangent here. It reminded me of this cool story. But they bought a bunch of Bibles and gave them to the troops, the British troops, not so that they would become faithful men of God as they go into battle, but because back then they didn't have Google Maps. You couldn't say, you didn't know where you were going. They literally gave it to them and said, study the Old Testament so you can get a lay of the land. And so they come in, this one bunch of troops, British troops, led by a guy named General Allenby. And they come to a place called Michmash, still called Michmash that day. And one of the troops famously says, well, I just read about Michmash. Opens up the Bible, sees this victory of Jonathan and his armor bearer, and brings it up. It goes all the way up to General Allenby, and he uses the same tactic, and he uses the same approach, and defeats the Turks in that same place. So, neat little story. I say all that because you said the British were in control. They were in control of a lot of stuff at that time, and so I was trying to think. There was a famous lady who wrote, there's a book called something about the train. That doesn't give you much to work with at all. Something about a mystery on a train. Famous woman, British author of the 19th century. You'll know when I say it. Let's see. What is her name? No. Anyway, there was a famous author, woman, and she writes this story about, what is the famous story about a train? I'm going to rack my brain. I'll have to tell y'all in a minute. She writes this famous book about this train, and what the book was based on, or the background to her, the motivation for her book was this train that they took down to Iraq to do these archaeological digs. And this famous author ends up marrying a famous archaeologist back then. But so yeah, they just they were in control of the region, and so I'm kind of thankful because you think about, I think we talked last week about how in Iraq the Arabs, the Muslims, destroyed a lot of stuff over there. So I'm really kind of thankful because one of the most stable places in the world for some of these finds would be in the Western world. So I'm thankful that the British Museum, one of my dream trips, I've been talking about it for about 5 years now. We always take trips to Israel, people do, and Greece and Turkey. But I'd love to take a shorter trip, about a week long. You start in New York and you go to, and now my mind's just going way blank, famous museum in New York City. They house some of the findings from Israel. Not Smithsonian, that's in Washington, D.C. the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of New York. They house some of these findings as well, but I would love to go there, just stay a night, take people to see those findings, take a plane to London, and spend about 4 or 5 days going through the British Museum and looking at all of these things. It would take forever. And then, of course, sightseeing in London, but to be able to see some of those things in Britain, because it's really neat. When we take the tour in Israel, you spend all this time, you go all the way up north, you come all the way down south, you come all the way up, and then you go to the museums, and everything you've talked about, a lot of the stuff you've talked about, you go in and you look at it, you see it, stuff like that. So, any other questions? That was a great question. None. All right, we'll pray and be done for this week. Father, we come before you. We thank you again for the information and the technology and the leadership of the Spirit to allow people to discover and decipher and to hand these things out to us so that we'll better understand our history of our Bible and have more faith in you. Let us be a light to the world as we go forth the rest of this week and bring us safely back here this Sabbath. We love you, we bless you, and we give you thanks. Amen.